This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. As Tony Hancock might have said, has Radio 4 gone stark raving mad?
I'm not sure what's going on with the iPlayer version of the news quiz this evening. It sounds like they're in a rave.
The problems with BBC iPlayer go from bad to worse. Or should I have said, have gone from bad to worse? I'll have to talk to Matthew Paris. When Matthew discusses the finer points of grammar, I need the slow-motion replay.
You get into the wills and the woulds and the coulds and the shoulds and the hads, and everyone just gets into the most awful muddle.
All will become clear later in the programme, I hope. And I'll be sunbathing in the middle of Windermere in the Lake District with Eric Robson and the Gardener's Question Time team. They can't walk on water, but they can certainly garden on it. First, the story that continues to dominate our inbox, the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Last week, you may remember, we interviewed Phil Peagum, the producer of Radio 4's The Moral Maze, about what some listeners claimed was the overheated behaviour of some of the panellists in an edition called Just War and Gaza. Following that interview, we have received many more emails about the Moral Maze and about the BBC's coverage of the conflict in general. Many of you think the BBC is biased and is either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli.
Hello, my name's Ailsa McClellan. I'm phoning from Ullapool in Wester Ross. I'm so sick of your skewed coverage of the conflict in Palestine. Another UN school has been repeatedly shelled, killing children and parents in their sleep, yet the bit of coverage on this incident that you chose to cover in the short section of news at lunchtime was the Israeli spokesperson, Paul Hirschson, maintaining that there were often Hamas bombs hidden in schools. I can hardly listen or watch the BBC at the moment because of the weak line that you take on this overall.
Hello, my name is Daniel Stillett. I live in London. It seems to me that what we have here is one long condemnation of Israel. I absolutely feel that the BBC's credibility is in doubt. I cannot trust it. I cannot rely on it for comprehensive and balanced information.
As the Gaza conflict has escalated, so the pressure on reporters on the ground has done so as well. Lise Doucette is the BBC's chief international correspondent. I spoke to her this week shortly after she had returned from Gaza.
Every day is a battle to survive, but most of all for Gazans, the nearly 2 million Gazans who are now living in the midst of a very, very punishing war. The BBC is fortunate that we have armoured vehicles, so we have 2 armoured vehicles which we have to share among our teams. When something happens, for example, if a school's been hit, you drive as far as you can, you measure where the fire is coming from, both rocket fire going out into Israel, incoming tank and artillery fire. You can hear it all the time. You have to constantly be making judgments about how far you can go.
When you're trying to find out what happened, which is your primary job, are there attempts all the time to mislead you?
Well, 'twas ever thus in a war,
so
as they say, the great truism about war. The truth is the first casualty. Every journalist now working on either side depends on, for the statistics, two sources of information. The Gazan Health Ministry, which I think is doing a fairly good job given the circumstances they're working under, gives us the figures of the dead, the injured, which are based on how many bodies come into the morgue, how many people are received at the hospital. And some of the Israeli Defense Forces tell you how many attacks did Israel carry out, how many rockets were fired from Gaza, how many of them were intercepted by their very effective American-financed Iron Dome system. So they give you all those. And I think, both of them have a high degree of legitimacy. We're often challenged to say, how come you're taking figures from the Hamas-controlled health ministry? But I think by and large, they are as close as possible to being an accurate reflection.
Now, the allegation made by the Israelis and by those also who perceive you as being biased in some way is that you're not pointing out or not working hard enough to discover whether Hamas is in fact firing rockets from schools, from hospitals. In other words, is embedded precisely in those areas which are targeted. Have you been able to discover whether this is a conscious policy of Hamas?
back to our point about it, in all wars, it's very difficult for security reasons, for propaganda reasons, to get to the full truth. I try to concentrate on what I see. And you can actually, if you look hard enough, you can see a lot. For example, there was one day on a street, we walked past an alleyway into a building, and a man came out and he gestured to some of the young men who were walking on the street. He's sort of saying, go, go, go. And we walked past not really knowing why he said that. And then immediately a mortar was fired. So we knew he had been firing mortars from inside that building. There's no doubt that Hamas is firing, and Islamic Jihad, they're firing from inside residential areas. They're firing from open fields. They deny that they're using Palestinians as human shields. Of course, it might depend on what your definition is as a human shield. Their defense would be, and the defense of Gazans, when you say to them, don't you blame Hamas for your fate? They're using your homes. They say, well, where can they go? There's no place for them to go. It's such a densely populated area that they have no other choice but to fire from in there. But for international human rights groups, these are violations of international humanitarian law, and both sides have been accused of violating it in this war.
Sometimes, do you have to go? I can't do anything. I've got to go walk. I have to stay away. Otherwise, my anger or my emotions will overcome me.
I think as a BBC broadcaster, my job is to be professional in the same way that a medic's job is to be professional.
Yeah, but you're a human being.
Yes, but you're in being a human being, I always say our journalism is defined by the questions we ask. So we ask, why have so many children been hit? What was the target in this place? Why, in the case of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, why are you firing rockets from residential areas? My job is to be the storyteller, to tell other people's stories, and I need to have composure to do that. And I've wrestled with this issue about taking sides and how far we can go a lot, because in my career I've often been reporting on areas where there are 2 sides, 3 sides, and all sides. I believe it is fine within my mandate as a public service broadcaster to be on the side of the people, to be on the side of children. It's wrong. It's wrong to target the civilians. We're talking about international human rights law. There are laws, there are rules, even in war.
How difficult is it to face the sort of accusations as bias that we get to feedback and you must get as well? Both sides saying you're clearly biased, you're clearly deliberately giving one side of the story.
I have to say that it pains a lot of us. Most of the correspondents and producers who've been working on this latest story have been going back and forth to the Middle East, to this particular region, for decades. And I can sit here and put my hand on my heart to say our conscience is clear, that we do make an effort to try to cover all sides of the story. But we also understand that people feel passionately about these stories. There are, of course, the lobby groups whose job it is to keep pushing and putting pressure on us, lobby groups on both sides. But there are also the people who just care a lot about this story. And so if they see something on air or hear something on the radio or something online, they vent their anger against us because they see us as somehow not telling the real story. And I have found, my own experience has been that with most of these people who say, for example, contact me on Twitter and who say, you are this or you are that I respond and say, thank you very much. I'm sorry you have that impression. We are trying. 9 times out of 10, they come back and say, thank you. Some people just want to be recognized, that they want us to know that they believe that we're doing it wrong. And 2 decades ago, what we would say to the criticism is, don't judge us by one report. Please judge us by the length and breadth and depth of our reports over a period of time. And now what we're saying is, don't judge us by one tweet. And sometimes they make legitimate points. I'll say, actually, they have a point. I must, and I say, thank you. I should look more closely at that. You're right. That is something. So it's very useful as well. So all I would say to your listeners is, and maybe they won't believe me, but I can speak for myself and all my colleagues. We are trying, and we will keep trying to tell a very difficult story. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is one of the easiest places to work in the world because there's so many spokespersons and so much information. But it is also the hardest place to work in the world because people care so deeply about it.
The BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, shortly to go back to the Middle East. Now, last week we heard from many listeners who couldn't catch up with programmes they'd missed because of a weekend-long breakdown of the BBC iPlayer. We were assured that the problems were being resolved. Oh yes, shortly after we aired our interview about what went wrong, we started receiving tweets from fans of the news quiz. @Colin Elves tweeted,
I'm not sure what's going on with the iPlayer version of the news quiz this evening. It sounds like they're in a rave.
Sandy Toksvig in a rave? Glow sticks held aloft? Possible, but not likely. And the news quiz wasn't the only Radio 4 programme to be mysteriously swapped for the big beats of Radio 1.
This is Mel Tisdale. I try to get a book at bedtime.
Nella climbs the spiral staircase until she reaches a long corridor at the end of which is another large oak door.
When it came up, the sound recording was music in inverted commas. I suppose if I were 50 years younger, I'd probably have to give you great detail and probably love it. But quite frankly, it was horrible.
Hello, my name's Tracy Wenham. I tried to listen to the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, but instead I got the Scott Mills Show from Radio 1.
How could they mix the two up? This is the latest statement from the iPlayer team.
Due to an unforeseen technical issue on Friday with one of our automatic recorder systems, a number of catch-up radio programmes or parts of programmes were incorrectly recorded from Radio 1. As soon as we realised there was a problem, we began removing these programmes and republishing them with the correct content. We apologise for this inconvenience.
Overall, not a happy period for iPlayer.
We regret that the last 2 weekends have been disappointing for audiences using our service. We do, however, believe this is not typical, and in general, over the last year, our systems have been more resilient than ever. We're working hard to ensure these problems don't happen again.
It's now time for what is becoming my regular Mea Culpa feature. At the end of the last edition of Feedback, I mentioned that I was going to Lake Windermere to visit a recording of the Radio 4 institution that is Gardener's Question Time. Andrew Ashbridge immediately got in touch to say,
"Good grief, Roger. Surely all Cumbrians know there's only one lake in the Lake District."
Indeed, you're right, Andrew. We do, and it's called Bassenthwaite. All the rest have water, not lake, in their title. Well, except those who have mere instead, like Grasmere and Thirlmere, or indeed Windermere. Its original name was Winandermere, by the way, and it is the longest lake in the country, 10 miles long in fact, and just a mile wide. Here is another little-known piece of information. The sun does occasionally shine on it, and it did so gloriously on Monday this week when I joined the Gardener's Question Time team and 150 of their fans in the middle of the lake for a recording. Our ship was the MV Teal, which is used to carrying royalty. This time it had to make do with Eric Robson, who is currently celebrating his 20th anniversary as the chairman of GQT. I've one very obvious question for you, Eric. Why on earth are we here on the water and not on land?
Because we go where gardeners go. We've done a lot of village halls, we've done a lot of gardening societies, but the majority of gardeners are not members of garden societies. They don't spend their time camping out in the village hall, and so we go all sorts of places. London Underground Station, a nudist colony.
Did you know what you were getting into when you were asked to chair the programme? 20 years ago now?
I was told two things. First of all, Michael Green, who was then controller of Radio 4, said to me, "You do realise, Eric, I'm not offering you a job here. I'm handing you the keys to Middle England."
No pressure.
And the second point was one of the old worthies on the programme who said, "You do realise, lad, that there'll be many a place you go to when you or the panel are the only people in the room with your own teeth and hair." And that has dramatically changed in the 20 years I've been making the programme.
What, you've got a young audience now?
We've got a much younger audience now. A lot more women are gardening, particularly from ethnic minority communities.
The panellists don't know the questions before the programme starts. Why not?
They always did used to know them, and we just felt that it would give a greater sense of spontaneity to the programme.
But isn't it a bit nerve-wracking for the panel and for you?
Yeah, they're paid well for it, though. And I know the questions beforehand because myself and the producer go through them. We sift them. And the only reason we do that, rather than just taking it from the floor, that lady with a funny hat in the back left-hand corner, is because we would have questions on slugs and snails. How do you stop your neighbour's cat crapping in my vegetable patch? And, how do you get rid of moles?
Well, the sun is still scorching down on Lake Windermere, not something I've said often in my life. And I'm joined by a person I want to call Captain Paul Holdsworth.
Skipper, please. Skipper, not too formal.
What's the question you want to ask this evening?
I drive a boat called Sunflower, which is a little wooden launch, classic launch, and I'm wondering what plant I should grow in a pot on the roof of Sunflower.
I've come downstairs and to meet the panellists who look extraordinarily relaxed for people who don't know the questions they're going to have to answer. I mean, are you this relaxed, Bunny Guinness?
No, I am not. My stomach is churning knots. And I always eat massively. We always have these amazing teas, especially when it's WI. So I pig myself, and I think that's a nervous thing.
So, Pippa Greenwood, can you prepare for something like tonight?
Well, I don't think you can really, other than what you do anyway, which is trying to make sure you know what's going on. And when you do the sort of jobs we do, and you garden yourself, you know when flea beetles arrived on your brassicas, or when the weevils are attacking whatever it might be.
Bob Flowerdew, can you tell me something you really think will be asked tonight?
Well, probably hydrangeas, because this is an area that grows so many of them. They look wonderful because the soil's right, it's got the wet climate for them. So there'll probably be something on hydrangeas being pink when they want them to be blue.
I hate hydrangeas, so I wouldn't even think about them. I reckon it's got to have to be something either to do with potato blight, because it's really muggy weather, or birds eating crops and keeping birds off crops.
Right, and Bunny?
Tomatoes, I suppose, will be one about tomatoes aren't ripening, perhaps, because of the slightly lower light levels, and they've been slow to kick into business.
Well, we'll check. Hydrangeas, potato blight and tomatoes. Howard, how are you sorting them out?
Well, in our head is what's been in recent shows, so like the past 3 months. So if you've had a question on, I don't know, growing rhododendron within the past 3 months, you tend to avoid that. Obviously, if a question comes in which is a really bespoke planting, what can I plant in my garden, and the question's so unique to their garden, it doesn't apply to anybody listening. It's nice for them, but it's of no real use to us.
I think I mentioned, defecating cats in our earlier conversation.
And you've got one?
Yes, there's one.
But you're not going to ask it?
We're not going to use that one, no. Well, welcome aboard. Don't often get the chance to say that at the beginning of the programme, but today our audience of 150 or so enthusiastic gardeners is embarking at the pier at Bowness-on-Windermere at the start of a gentle cruise on England's biggest natural lake.
I'm an allotment virgin. I'm about to embark on...
Steady.
I'm joined by Gwen Higginson, who asked a question. Are you going to act upon any of the suggestions you've had from the panel?
Absolutely, definitely. Bob Flowerdew's answer about having fewer seeds rather than 300 is going to be a good tip.
What potted plant would the panel recommend I grow on Sunflower's roof?
Well, hello, Skipper. You did get your question.
I did, didn't I? That was good.
Yes, and you enjoyed the repartee, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are you going to act upon the advice, though?
No.
No? Why not?
I'm going to get so much grief from my colleagues who are even asking the questions. It's so lovely.
Bob, can I ask you, no hydrangeas, no potatoes, no tomatoes?
Well, there we go. That's life, isn't it? But it's still an interesting collection of questions. It's been a lovely day out here. I didn't realise how beautiful the United Kingdom is. So this job for 20 years has taken me to every bit of it.
Well, Eric, we're now steaming back into port. As a northerner, do you think the programme is an antidote to a lot of Radio 4? You've heard even in the recent annual report concern that Radio 4 sounds too much like the South East.
Too metrocentric, absolutely.
Yeah.
We visit more places in these islands each year than any other Radio 4 programme.
They're just tying up the boat, and soon everyone will be off, having had a wonderful day. It's been like being part of a club, an institution. Everybody seems to know everybody else. Everybody seems to like everybody else. And they all love gardening. Eric, I have to ask one question. Is the fact that you live in perhaps the most out-of-the-way valley in the country, that is Wasdale, is the reason so nobody can come and check what your garden looks like?
Not at all. I don't have a garden. I keep telling you.
The Gardener's Question Time Chairman does not have a garden.
I don't. I have 25 acres of oak and ash woodland. I mow the odd track up into it. And from that point on, God does it better.
My thanks to the gardenless Eric Robson and to producer Howard Shannon from the production company that makes GQT something else. And of course to Bunny, Pippa and Bob. And of course to their fan club. If you have any questions for us, not them, please do get in touch. You can write to feedback at P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P4AX, or leave a phone message on 03333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can send an email to feedback@bbc.co.uk. Or you can tweet us on @BBCR4Feedback. All those details are on our website. And by the way, the radio listening figures, the radars, were released this week. They show that, for the first time, the BBC's digital station that was saved from the chop by you, the listeners, 6 Music, is now more popular than Radio 3. The power of the listener. Let us know what you think about that and anything else about BBC Radio. We read and listen to everything. And here's a flavour of what had you turning up and turning off the radio this week.
Hi, it's Paul Redmond from Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire. I just want to say thank you for the BBC radio stations for giving a special programme for the 50th anniversary of Teddy Blackburn's broadcasting years.
This is, I tell you, 50 years ago to this very day, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was 3.5 miles off the coast of Frinton.
I hope he's there for many years to come.
Hello, my name is Diana Davis. Please cease the persistent use of you know on air. The latest culprit was Gareth Malone on Radio 3 this week.
And I think that's why we go for those, as they call them, the money notes in opera. There is that feeling of...
I want to shout back, no, I don't know, but I am waiting to hear you tell me.
Hello, my name is Barbara Zielinska. I just wanted to say how pleased I was to hear Dead Ringers back after 7 years of air. The Dead Ringers are as brilliant as always.
Hello, I'm Michael Portillo, the only television presenter to be made entirely of leather.
This is Leslie Henry from Exmouth. I was utterly astounded by how bad the impressions were this time. If it hadn't been for the scripts telling you who the people were a lot of the time, it would have been almost impossible to recognise them.
So, total unanimity then. By now you've no doubt heard of the Clash of the Titans going on at Radio 4. I almost said dinosaurs, but didn't dare. John Humphrys admonished Melvyn Bragg over the use of the so-called historic present. That's putting history in the present, not the past tense. For example, William Wordsworth is walking along the edge of Ullswater. He sees some daffodils waving in the breeze. I think there may be a poem in that, he says. His sister Dorothy dutifully records the scene so he can use her words and claim the poem as his own. Fantasy, of course. John Humphreys merely called the use of the historic present by Lord Bragg irritating and pretentious. The resulting duel took place on The World at One this week.
And we're talking about, for the last 20 years, some of the best academics in this country, and sometimes best academics in the world, and a lot of them are using this. Now, they must think it's useful for them and their students, because they're all teaching academics. It's not my job to be the policeman.
No, I completely reject that idea that it makes it more vivid. I do genuinely think it makes it more confusing.
Much ado about nothing? Do listeners really care? Oh, yes, they do.
My name is Andy Mason. I enjoyed the recent long view comparing Nigel Farage with John Wilkes, but would have enjoyed it much more if you could just speak plain English.
John Wilkes dislikes a union that England is part of that he feels will lead to people from outside coming...
History is about the past. Why pretend otherwise?
Hi, I'm Jackie Carroll, phoning over from Jersey. I just can't stand its use, and I get so irritated I can't concentrate on the content. Sometimes I even turn off what would be an otherwise excellent programme.
Naturally, we look to the gods who run Radio 4 for a definitive ruling on the matter. They told us they celebrate and respect the entire richness and variety of the English language as it evolves through use and fashion. They want presenters and contributors to speak with freedom and feel relaxed enough to convey their many brilliant thoughts, ideas and stories, and wouldn't seek to enforce uniformity on something that is a question of linguistic taste. The man who identified this modern grammatical curse, if it be such, over 2 years ago in an article in The Times, was Matthew Paris, who of course also presents Radio 4's long-running biographical series Great Lives. I asked him why he was so passionate about its use, or rather misuse.
Oh, I wouldn't call it passionate. I don't think my emotions run to anything like passion. I'm petulant about it. I'm irritated by it. I'm irritated by it because it's a fad. It's a fad especially led by the academic world, whom you would think to be immune to herd pressure and fashionability, but who in fact all seem to start talking just like each other. And it's very confusing to listeners. It's confusing to me. I am very far from saying that the present historic tense, as we might call it, is always wrong. In fact, it has an ancient pedigree in English writing, and some of our greatest writers and poets have used it. And it's used to surprise the audience a little bit, because you suddenly slip into the present tense when talking about the past, and it surprises people with a sense of immediacy. So if you do it all the time, you lose the very point of it. You lose the element of surprise. You lose the immediacy.
So it can work sometimes. You can imagine history teachers trying to get into their pupils the idea that just imagine you don't know the result of an action. That's a valid way. Using the historic present in that sense is valid, isn't it? To make people feel how uncertain the future is.
It's an entirely valid way, and I'm sure I've used it, and I've heard it very well used by all kinds of very distinguished commentators. But there's a second difficulty with it, and that is that if you've slipped into the present when you're talking about the past, then you need to decide what tenses you're going to use. Let's say Anne Boleyn is feeling pretty insecure because she has noticed that the king has a little bit of a passion for Jane Seymour. What she doesn't know is that Jane Seymour, now what are we to say? That Jane Seymour would die later on, that the king would marry Jane Seymour, or are we to say what she doesn't know is that the king will marry Jane Seymour, who will die later on? And you get into the wills and the woulds and the coulds and the shoulds and the hads, and everyone just gets into the most awful muddle.
Now, did you used to think that you were a sort of voice crying in the wilderness on this issue? Because it was you know, who is, if you like, the only begetter of the row between Bragg and Humphreys, and that brought this thing to the forefront of people's attention.
Do you know, Roger, it was actually one of our listeners who wrote to me complaining about some of my guests on Great Lives talking in the past historic. And I actually wrote a rather robust reply saying, we've always done this in English. And then I started listening myself, and I realised how confusing it was to listeners. I don't think that you can lay down the law and police the use of English. John Humphreys can't, Melvyn Bragg can't, I certainly can't. But I do think you can find out, test the water, see how annoying other people are finding things. And then if you make a fuss, you may actually change the fashion.
Well, our listeners, feedback listeners, will be delighted with what they've heard from you, because they, or at least all those have written to us, share your views that this has to be stopped. Can they be guaranteed that when your new series returns, Great Lives, on the 5th of August, they will never hear the historic present?
They absolutely cannot be guaranteed. I hope they do sometimes hear it, and I hope they hear it sufficiently infrequently for it to do its job, which is to surprise the listener slightly.
Matthew Paris, we will be listening. Next week, I'll be in Glasgow to see how BBC journalists covering the Scottish referendum campaign are weathering the storms surrounding it, and, of course, accusations of bias. Perhaps it's time to send for Lise Doucette. Goodbye.
Among our teams, when something happens, for example, if a school's been hit, you drive as far as you can, you measure where the fire is coming from, both rocket fire going out into Israel, incoming tank and artillery fire. You can hear it all the time. You have to constantly be making judgments about how far you can go.
When you're trying to find out what happened, which is your primary job, are there attempts all the time to mislead you?
Well, 'twas ever thus in a war.
So
as they say, the great truism about war, truth is the first casualty. Every journalist now working on either side depends on, for the statistics, two sources of information. The Gazan Health Ministry, which I think is doing a fairly good job given the circumstance.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. As Tony Hancock might have said, has Radio 4 gone stark raving mad?
I'm not sure what's going on with the iPlayer version of the news quiz this evening. It sounds like they're in a rave.
The problems with BBC iPlayer go from bad to worse. Or should I have said, have gone from bad to worse? I'll have to talk to Matthew Paris. When Matthew discusses the finer points of grammar, I need the slow-motion replay.
You get into the wills and the woulds and the coulds and the shoulds and the hads, and everyone just...
What we have here is one long condemnation of Israel. I absolutely feel that the BBC's credibility is in doubt. I cannot trust it. I cannot rely on it for comprehensive and balanced information.
As the Gaza conflict has escalated, so the pressure on reporters on the ground has done so as well. Lise Doucette is the BBC's chief international correspondent. I spoke to her this week, shortly after she had returned from Gaza.
Every day is a battle to survive, but most of all for Gazans, the nearly 2 million Gazans who are now living in the midst of a very, very punishing war. The BBC is fortunate that we have armoured vehicles, so we have 2 armoured vehicles which we have to
Gets into the most awful muddle.
All will become clear later in the programme, I hope. And I'll be sunbathing in the middle of Windermere in the Lake District with Eric Robson and the Gardener's Question Time team. They can't walk on water, but they can certainly garden on it. First, the story that continues to dominate our inbox, the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Last week, you may remember, we interviewed Phil Peagum, the producer of Radio 4's The Moral Maze, about what some listeners claimed was the overheated behaviour of some of the panellists in an edition called Just War and Gaza. Following that interview, we have received many more emails about The Moral Maze and about the BBC's coverage of the conflict in general. Many of you think the BBC is biased and is either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli.
Hello, my name's Ailsa McClellan. I'm phoning from Ullapool in Wester Ross. I'm so sick of your skewed coverage of the conflict in Palestine. Another UN school has been repeatedly shelled, killing children and parents in their sleep, yet the bit of coverage on this incident that you chose to cover in the short section of news at lunchtime was the Israeli spokesperson, Paul Hirschson, maintaining that there were often Hamas bombs hidden in schools. I can hardly listen or watch the BBC at the moment because of the weak line that you take on this overall.
Hello, my name is Daniel Stillett. I live in London. It seems to me that